Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Benjamin Penny, if you don't know me. I work here in the Australian Centre on China and the World. And welcome to today's ANU China Seminar Series seminar. This is hybrid, so apart from those in the room, there are those on Zoom, and I'll have a word to you people on Zoom specifically in a moment. We're very pleased today to be able to welcome one of our own, Dr. Matthew Galway. Matt hasn't been that long at the ANU. How long have you been at the ANU?
Just under 2 years.
Oh, longer than I thought. Doesn't time fly when you're having fun? So Matt came to us immediately from the University of Melbourne, and before that from the University of British Columbia, where he did his PhD, and before that from the University of Ottawa, where he was an undergraduate. So Matt is the expert, or one of the experts in the world, I think, on the spread of Maoism around the world. And it's wonderful that here at the ANU we're able to have a really strong research and teaching emphasis on modern China, not just contemporary China, but the periods further back. So we now cover in our Chinese studies historical ambit, pre-modern, right back to ancient now, Republican period, late Qing Republican, Maoist, and then contemporary. So it's really pleasing that over the last few years we've been able to build up a group of younger scholars, much younger than me, who are able to complete our jigsaw, as it were. And it's wonderful that Matt is one of those people. It's also very pleasing that Matt is one of those people who, while a specialist on Chinese history, is also able to look beyond the confines of the boundaries of the nation state and look at China's interactions with other places, in this case, in Southeast Asia and Cambodia. But I know that he also has interests in the influence of Maoism in other parts of the world, South America, Latin America, Africa, and so forth. This is really a strong way, I think, to start to think about world history rather than broad swathes, very much a foundation within the history of one place, the history of the ideas of one place, and then watching the spread. And of course, Maoism is one of the most profound, or at least profoundly influential patterns of thought in the 20th century. So it's superb that Matt is doing this work, and he's doing this work amongst us. So we're all very pleased. Today's talk is about his new book, The Emergence of Global Maoism, China's Red Evangelism and the Canadian Communist Movement, 1949 to 79. Is it fair to say it's been long awaited?
Okay, so.
Yeah, it's been long awaited, but it's wonderful that the wait is over.
Yes.
Yes. So Matt will now address this, is his first of, I'm sure, many profound and substantial scholarly contributions in this area. But I won't go on any further because I don't want to take your time. So please, Matt. Oh, sorry, I have to say one other thing, which is housekeeping. When we come to questions and answers at the end, people on Zoom, please ask your questions via the chat function. When you ask your question, I will be dealing with the questions and answers. So I will read your questions, relaying them to Matt, who will answer them. For those in the room, because we don't have a traveling microphone, it all gets too difficult. When I ask questions from the audience, if you ask a question, I'll then repeat it for the people on Zoom, and then Matt will answer it. That's the way we found. It's a little cumbersome, but it's the best solution we've got. Okay, over to you, my friend.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. Fantastic, and thank you everybody for showing up here in person, and for all of our attendees online. My thanks also to the Australian National University and the Australian Centre for China and the World for hosting my talk on my book today. Please do let me know online if the audio does cut out or you can't hear me clearly. I'm more than happy to project my voice more than I am now. So just to get us started today, if I can get there we go, awesome. So today's book talk will consist of a triptych of sorts. I'm going to focus on specifically the theory travel, the main theoretical framework, the expanded theoretical framework that I introduce in this book and building upon the work of Edward Said. Then we will go through the background of the Sino-Khmer friendship and CCP diplomacy, providing the mise-en-scène for the case study of Hu Nim, someone who is one of the foundational figures in Cambodia when it comes to talking about Maoism, how it makes its way to Cambodian intellectual circles, and how it's written about, thought about, and then acted upon in the revolution. I'll then proceed to the Association d'Amitié Khmer-Chinoise, also known as the Samāgam Mittphāp Khmer-Chin, which is the Khmer-Chinese Friendship Association, an overtly Maoist cultural diplomatic group consisting of Chinese and Khmer students. I'll then conclude with just some remarks from the book, and I'll look forward to questions by that point. So what I often do is when I give a talk on the book project, I try and provide some voices of the zeitgeist of the era, a period of time where you're having what David Chandler has referred to as the springtime of revolutions, right? Decolonization throughout various parts of what we call the global south, and this conceptualization of countries as sharing a world stage with others in a similar positionality. And for me, L'Homme Révolté really captures this with a few resonant quotes from Albert Camus, one of my favorite French philosophers. The spirit of rebellion can only exist in groups where a theoretical equality conceals great factual inequalities. We'll see in the work of Hu Nim an attempt to try and address and diagnose and then propose novel solutions for such inequalities. In every rebellion, one finds the metaphysical demand for unity, the impossibility of capturing it, and the construction of a substitute universe. Rebellion from this point of view is a fabricator of universes. And we will see both in the case of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, the Maoist Khmer Rouge, aka the Khmer Rouge, that they attempted to create this new universe in brutal fashion. And then rebellion cannot exist without a strange form of love. Those who find no rest in God or in history are condemned to live for those who, like themselves, cannot live, in fact, for the humiliated. And I think this captures two of the, I guess we could call it a Janus-based phenomenon in Hu Nim, as someone who genuinely and earnestly wanted to uplift peasants in his constituency of Kampuchea, and someone who wanted to, out of the, his own ideology, his own philosophical ethos, find a way to make Cambodia a better country than it was presently after independence, but someone who, of course, falls in with a very radical crowd and is ultimately, through his own outspokenness, sidelined in a very grotesque fashion after torture and during his imprisonment as Tuol Sleng prison, S21 prison in Phnom Penh. So just a brief kind of overview of the theoretical framework that I introduced in the book, drawing heavily from The World, the Text, and the Critic by Edward Said. He provides two main conditions for how ideas travel across cultures: the production, the transmission, and the reception. So production is the idea, it's produced, it's transmitted somehow, and then it is received by a host, audience of some sorts. So I've expanded upon this by trying to add layers to the reception stage of this, because I don't think reception is an especially facile category. Then looking, because this is Maoism, adaptation and implementation. So looking at reception as something that has an impact and one tries to relate to it. That's what gives it kind of some type of currency with the person who's receiving it and engaging with it seriously. Understanding the historical conditions into which those ideas emerge. And then the first practical attempt to apply those. This can also lead to adaptation, where they, again, either in intellectual or in practical forms, try and put that idea into practice. And since Maoism places such emphasis on practice above all things, this can lead to the returning back to the drawing board through the practice and applying the lessons learned through that initial intellectual and or practical implementation or adaptation to try and then devise it based on the lessons learned from the initial practical effort. And then the normative production, which kind of cyclically brings us back to production again, but in this case, it is an attempt to try and adapt it even further to those beyond the initial group who first received it. So the implementation stage, I won't get into too much today, but it's essentially what you'll see in the CCP era, the first years of the Communist Party of China's rule of the PRC, where they're attempting to consolidate power in the hands of the party by eliminating enemies during campaigns like the first land reform and then the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. then economic reconfiguration, Dialectical, the Great Leap Forward, and then the social transformation / revolutionary perpetuation phase, Wenhua Dageming, the Cultural Revolution. The reason why I bring these latter two things up, and you could even argue all three, is that the Khmer Rouge attempted, even uncreatively, to apply these very same policies in Cambodia from 75 to 79. So where these subset phases come from, primarily from the brilliant work of Philip Kuhn, who in his Origins of the Taiping Vision identified the language of the materials as one important factor in understanding how ideas travel across cultures, specifically hellfire and brimstone Protestantism, and how it found its way, how it gained currency among Hong Shou-Chien, this failed civil service student. Then the conceptualization in specific concrete conditions, or the conditions of the reception. Hong Shou-Chien's, again, another rich case study where he's initially rejects what he reads in the book Good Words to Admonish the Age by Young Afa, and then he returns to it upon having a dream where he's, God's Chinese son, so to speak, to borrow from Jonathan Pence. And then the process whereby the ideas resonate with others, how these ideas find currency among people outside of that intellectual milieu that first engages with the idea. So I've got Mao there. I went with baby Mao for the last talk, so I've just gone for a more youthful looking Mao Zedong in this one. The goal here today is to track the encounters with radical materials and the subsequent ideological turn to Maoism from the early life experiences, both inside and outside cosmopolitan cores, to major epicenters, to becoming influential admirers of the Chinese Revolution and Maoism. In the case here, we'll be looking at Hu Nim instead of just all of the main figures that I cover in the book. And the aim is also to take seriously the engagements with radical ideological discourses in social experiences and political writings, and to identify how Hu Nim spoke back once he became an intellectual activist politician in Cambodia's global 60s. So the reason why I'm doing all of this is because there is no extant language, English language intellectual history on neither the China-Cambodia relationship or just on the figures who I'll be talking about today, particularly Hu Nim. There are French studies that have made initial attempts by Henri Lecard and Sacha Cher. Specifically, these pieces try to connect the dots between ideas that people like Hu Nim and Pol Pot engaged with and how they relate to the actual practice and the genocide itself. But these pieces don't look at Chinese language materials. These pieces don't, in many cases, don't even use Khmer language materials. So this becomes something that needs to be corrected. Here we have on the right-hand side a picture of Sung Sekun's book, Itinéraire d'un intellectuel Khmer Rouge. This is a former member of the Khmer Rouge who himself had studied in Paris and had visited China and considered himself a contemporary of the Khmer Rouge core, Hu Nim included. And in his biography, he's very much talking about all the reasons why China emerged as an important wellspring for ideas and that, models that Cambodia could follow. However, again, this piece is all tinged by kind of post-hoc narratives. I used to be Khmer Rouge, good thing I found the light and I rejected all these things and I got out early. So it does have its problems as well, but it is certainly, again, this is what we're working with. So my goal here with this book was to track the origins of the CPK Weltanschauung or worldview, to try and break the trend of how these prima facie explanations avoid looking at social experiences, avoid looking at social topographies, are less inclined to dig into the intellectual exchanges, and don't look at the language of the materials and explain how they get to from A to B. How are, for instance, Hu Nim, how's he reading Maoist materials? He doesn't just become one. What are the materials he's looking at? What language are they in and why? So just again, the book covers of some of these resources here, or some of these secondary sources that try to, again, dig into the intellectual history of the CPK. So I think one thing to just get us kind of started off here is to explain, first of all, how Maoism becomes something that can be exported. And it wasn't initially something that was to happen. The CCP, when they took state power, were very, very much surprised that they took state power, but were certainly very excited about the opportunity, the prospect of establishing and expanding what they had been doing in their revolutionary base areas. The CCP's efforts from 49 until 1955 was what scholars have called, including Peter Van Ness, the spirit of Bandung, trying to create the image of China as something that isn't like not a hostile territory, not a hostile state, especially after Korea, the Korean War. and the PRC's involvement in that war, there was an effort to try and break that isolation of the PRC so that it could, again, build friendly allies outside of the socialist bloc. This then gives way to a revolutionary approach whereby the PRC is active in supporting revolutions rhetorically abroad. This is, of course, Vietnam is one of the big ones, and this will then give way to a radical ideological approach where it is not only supporting materially and rhetorically these revolutions, it is actively seeking to export Maoism abroad through the massive translation and dissemination of Mao's works. And this emerges during the Cultural Revolution, where foreign languages press, Waiwan Chuban and the International Bookstore, the Guoji Tushu, these are big outlets that will translate and disseminate Mao's works into dozens of languages. So I'll just proceed very quickly to how this relates to Cambodia. Independent in 1953, formerly protected of France, we'll get back into that in a bit. Cambodia is under the leadership of Prince then King Sihanouk. He's pictured in both of those images there with very familiar characters to all of you, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, etc. And China becomes one of independent Cambodia's first major allies. And I mean allies in the sense that they're not banding up with Cambodia so they can take advantage of it or create a cyclical aid dependency. It is at Bandung where Sihanouk's delegation is able to befriend Zhou Enlai. Julio Haldris's work has looked into this more extensively. But this personal bond that Sihanouk builds with Zhou Enlai and then with Mao Zedong creates this very special bond between China and Cambodia, even though the Cambodia is run by a non-communist, purportedly Buddhist socialist and democratically elected monarch. So this creates, again, it has a dual function, which I'll discuss a little bit more. Sihanouk becomes this beloved figure in China. He's already beloved in Cambodia. He has the Devaraja, he's a charismatic figure. People continuously support him because of his purported divinely charisma and the fact, of course, he's also very likable and has a lot of smart and cultured things to say. But in China, he is a symbol to sell the revolution and sell the CCP to its own people. Here, China is a protector of world peace. Look at us, we're inviting someone who is a non-communist. Look, we're inviting somebody who is anti-imperialist, but not somebody who is going to be receptive to revolution. And in fact, he's a monarch, which we should hate ideologically. But anyways, it sells a lot of newspapers for Remen Ribao, I'm sure. So having Sihanouk visit, as well as several other major leaders, is part of a massive program of hosting foreign representatives that the CCP tries to do to reshape its image and reshape the PRC's image as it tries to, again, receive support from countries outside of the socialist bloc. Again, they are not occupying the seat in the United Nations. That is still the Republic of China until the 1970s. This has a domestic and international purpose. As I mentioned, it convinces those, it sells to people who might still have their doubts that the CCP is in fact one of the world leaders, if not the world leader of global communism, and that they're also safeguarding world peace by having such friendly relations with other countries. Mao's ideas of greater unity through global realignment, which eventually becomes his three world theory, presented during visits of heads of state and leaders of parties that oppose them. This includes Pol Pot's secret visit in '65. We'll get to that later. This is also part of this PRC's own path to gradually distance itself from a now de-Stalinizing Soviet Union and to again posit itself as the leader of communism abroad. So it is during this time in the mid-1950s, just around 1956, 57, that you get overseas Chinese newspapers sponsored by the CCP in foreign countries that try and promote China as this protector of world peace and the supporter of anti-imperialism globally. And one really rich resource that I've looked into that previously historians of neither Cambodia or China have really dug into seriously, not since William Wilmot's 1967, The Chinese of Cambodia, is Mianhua Ribao, or Sino-Khmer Daily, also translated into as Khmer-Chinese Daily. And this Phnom Penh-based newspaper was the official propaganda outlet of the PRC embassy in Cambodia. And this newspaper was replete with headlines that not only praised Sihanouk for his neutrality or neutralism, as Nicholas Tarling has described, but also pointing out that the China-Cambodia friendship is magnificent, as deep as the sea, unbreakable, and a flower that must forever be in bloom. So I just have some, again, they're pretty rough photocopies, but this is what the best I could do at the Xiamen University Southeast Asia Center back in 2015. But just again, some particular, the titles that you get there. This is in contravention to a lot of the French language media outlets that were trying to cast Sihanouk as this perverse playboy who was not serious, as well as a puppet to Chairman Mao. So here I just have an image from the Lon Nol era that is jumping a little bit ahead, but to just kind of, again, contrast it. It is also at this time where in China, there's a greater interest in the media outlets, including Ditu Jianbao, War Dispatches Daily, to dig into events geographically that are going on around China. So here we just have one issue. It's also the inspiration for the cover art of the book of what's going on in Vietnam. Where's the war happening? Here's the belligerents and things that you should know. So for sharing that information with the general public. Just again, another image here of Mao presenting a medal to Sihanouk for, again, his neutrality and anti-imperialism. Just the details there. Now, as I mentioned, they're also hosting people who are actively fighting against them. And Pol Pot is one of the most famous cases, although it was a secret visit, the most famous cases of the CCP double dealing in a sense. So officially, the PRC's on record position on Cambodia was to support Sihanouk at all costs. Personal friendships aside, strategically, it was important to have him in Cambodia as a non-hostile ally who was friendly and could also not, stop the Vietnamese from doing what they were doing against the French and then the Americans in the Vietnam Wars. But nonetheless, Pol Pot, then known, going by that name and previously known as Salot Sa, has returned from study in France without his degree in '53, and then gradually worked his way up the Vietnamese or Hanoi-backed Khmer Workers' Party. And he decides by the mid-1960s that it's time to go and ask the Vietnamese to prioritize overthrowing Sihanouk. This is because in the mid-60s, Sihanouk had made significant strides to try and curtail left and right in his National Assembly, all in the pursuance of a hard neutral stance. Pol Pot takes the trip to Hanoi and meets with Le Duan, one of the leading figures of the Vietnamese Communist Party, then the Vietnamese Workers' Party. And Le Duan tells him that victory in South Vietnam is paramount and that Cambodia must wait its turn. But Pol Pot then decides, I'm going to move on to Beijing, where he meets in a secret meeting, then as an attaché of the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, the predecessor party to the Khmer Rouge. He meets with several CCP officials. Some even claim he met with Mao, but I doubt those sources. And he stays as all good communists visiting China at the time do at the Yafela Pishuzhongshin, just outside of Beijing. And it is during this trip that various leaders, including purportedly Liu Shaoqi, said that his program was great. And Mao read a translated version of his program, which probably was in French, we still don't know, but said that they should definitely act upon it and that his theory was by and large correct. They should attack Sihanouk and overthrow him, which is what they will do in a few short years after his return. So I think getting a sense of how these trips work, both for China and for these foreign revolutionaries to then kind of say, okay, we've got a major power who's got our back. We don't have to rely on maybe Moscow saying, do this and do that. And maybe Moscow saying, maybe we should work with the bourgeois nationalist parties and, little things like that. There's also this massive effort by the CCP in the 1960s to translate and disseminate Mao's works, specifically in the form of the Little Red Book. So this occurs because, of course, of these extant methods to spread wisdom in China. There's the Zhongshan Bu is one major agency that is able to produce these materials, get them out. There's also communist claims to represent an absolute truth of a scientific world, which makes it broadly kind of applicable to revolutionaries and societies who are seeking to break the trend of cyclical dependency and exploitation. The Little Red Book's ingenious physical format, as Daniel Leese has explored in his book chapter 4, Global Maoism, or Maoism, a Global History, or sorry, the Little Red Book, A Global History. And then the political environment during the Cultural Revolution, the Mao-centric iconoclasm, and just the repeated emphasis on Mao's thought as undeniable wisdom. Now, I've mentioned the Foreign Languages Press and International Bookstore. These are major agencies that produce, translate, and disseminate these works, the Little Red Book in particular, at little to no cost. It's made very cheaply, but durably because of the vinyl cover. And these materials, as the propaganda poster kind of indicates, are massively produced and disseminated worldwide. You can find them pretty much anywhere. I'm still looking to track down some obscure language versions of them myself, but they never made one in the Khmer language. It never was translated into Khmer. Again, the Cultural Revolution, there's this shift to try and broadcast, disseminate, propagate the Chinese revolutionary experience and Maoism globally. This another issue from another issue of Ditu Jianbao, and the main inspiration for the cover art of the book is calling for, the spreading of Mao's thought as if it is the brilliant sun at the center of the world, and that its rays will extend to all corners of the earth, going to Latin America, even down to Australia, Canada, up to Canada, the United States, continental Africa, and Europe. And the images below give a sense of what that could entail, whether it's study sessions, doing actual tours of the Chinese countryside, through cultural diplomatic exchanges and student associations, and then through active support of freedom fighters and revolutionaries in places like Africa, where various countries are going through waves of decolonization at the time. I just have some images from Renmin Huabao, a major outlet at the time that was producing these very rich, colorful images from China. And just again, to show the importance of the Little Red Book domestically in China instead of just internationally. Again, here we have some soldiers who are reading Mao's Little Red Book to provide an interesting contrast to these domestic cases. In Tanzania, workers on the Tazara Railway could take frequent breaks so long as they were reading the Little Red Book or translated versions of the collection or these selected works of Chairman Mao, which I find quite fascinating. I would take many breaks because I heard that working conditions were not great on the working on the Tazara Railway. So now that we got a sense of importance of these foreign visits, the effort by the CCP to broadcast Maoism globally, and the importance of having these pieces translated, that gets us to the main player who is kind of going to figure prominently in this story, and that's Hu Nim. Now, he was not born into any kind of wealth or elite privilege. He was born in rural Kokor village, Kopong Siem, in 1930 to mixed Sino-Khmer lineage. He himself did not know how to read Chinese, like many Sino-Khmer in the area, Popon included, though from a different village, Breksabov. He nonetheless had that lineage. He was raised in a poor peasant family, unlike his future contemporaries, Popon and Kusampan, who were quite wealthy, though they did have a rural upbringing. Because Hu Nim was poor, he lived in Wat Mien, where he became a remarkable and talented student, and he was able to win, despite his socioeconomic positionality, admission to the prestigious Collège Notre-Dame Sihanouk, a junior high school in Kompong Cham, named after the prince who would become the father or the first democratic elected leader, but also kind of like the national father. So it is during this time also that, again, Cambodia is a protectorate of France. It is run like a colonial police state, as John Tully has described, ruled with an iron hand under the aegis of the region's true authority, the Gouverneur Général and the Résidence Supérieure. So they ran Cambodia very much like it was a colony, certainly not for extraction, but just how they treated it. And because of the French attitudes of the era, I think you get a real sense of this really slow-moving nationalism and this really slow-moving intellectual class that starts to emerge. But I think that that's an important to kind of track how those ideas about needing to liberate Cambodia and needing to break the trend of French colonial suppression, why they rise to importance. Now, as David Chandler's pointed out in his work, and Penny Edwards expanded upon in her book Cambodge, the French, when they show up, they're fascinated with what they see in the former Khmer Empire, this massive Southeast Asian empire that was unrivaled, but certainly contentious with neighboring Ayutthaya and the Dai Viet for hundreds of years, in Champa as well. French ethnographers, French archaeologists, anthropologists all come to these temples that they quote unquote discover, which we all know they did not. But they believe in seeing these massive temples in these cities that could have once existed with millions of inhabitants, that this is a civilization on par with the Roman Empire and ancient Greece. And these archaeologists talk about past Khmer civilization as a once great, unrivaled civilization. But they also juxtapose it against its present state of weakness. Cambodia did not exist until the French showed up. Before that, Khmer lands were in steep decline since the fall of the Khmer Empire in the 15th century, and were gradually getting eaten away by neighboring Ayutthaya, which will become the Kingdom of Siam, and then Thailand, and then the Dai Viet, which will eventually become Vietnam. So when the French arrive in the 1860s, they are able to cut deals with the ruling Khmer leaders and say, here is your geo-body, so to speak. Thank God we showed up to save you. So imagine what the kind of psychological effect this will have on a nascent intellectual class, where all they're learning is, you used to be great, now you're really weak and really desperate for our salvation. Thank God we're here to civilize, provide all this information of the greatness of French civilization. It makes, in the typical French racist colonial naivete, a sense of hatred of the French and wanting to remove them, and in fact use French thought and achievement to do so. So I just have some images here, again, of some French tourists who visit Angkor Wat in 1922. This is just the area around Hu Nim, where Hu Nim was born. This is a map provided by French anthropologist Etienne Ammonier. And then a map of Penh, a city that we will definitely want to look at in a bit. Just again, here we have the international colonial expedition, Angkor Wat figuring very prominently. So that French obsession with the temples, or the temple complex, so to speak, it's already beginning to form. If anybody has ever been to the Musée de l'Asie Sud-Est Guimer, or the Southeast Asia Museum in Paris, every other Southeast Asian country gets a small room. It's very nicely curated, but tiny. The main atrium is all the Khmer Empire stuff that they pillaged. So again, this juxtaposition with past greatness and present day weakness creates again the sense of needing to end, if you're going to try and end French colonialism, that you got to find a way to get there first. And what's interesting is that people like Hu Nim didn't start out as nationalists. In fact, there was the semiotics of status in French Cambodia is that French and France are the prisms through which they view the world. They attend French schools, they grow up in a French colony for all intents and purposes. And it's during this time, the centralized French educational system has the entire student body master the same knowledge. If you're attending the collège or the lycée, you're learning the same thing in the other collèges and lycées elsewhere in the country. The goal is to get the students to identify with French history and political values. As Khieu Samphan, future premier of Democratic Kampuchea, and somebody who is now thankfully rotting in a cell, we were profoundly influenced by the spirit of French thought, by the age of enlightenment of Rousseau and Montesquieu. The irony is that the French, in trying to train Khmers to become proper civil servants of a French domain, their words, don't realize that this immersion in French inspired, this immersion in French and French classics actually inspires nationalist imaginings by dint of the emphasis on thought and achievement. Who'd have thought that having students read about liberté, égalité, and fraternité would make people want all of those things for themselves? It's about that time where Hu Nim and his cohort really come into the picture. Through passing their examinations, from the collège to the Lycée Sissouf, the elite private French language school, high school, they're able to win bursaries to go study in France, particularly in Paris. And some of the figures that I've looked in my book more extensively, such as Pol Pot and Hu Yun and Khieu Samphan, are all part of the same cohort at different times, but nonetheless, there is that kind of comradeship of association, to borrow from Benedict Anderson. And it is at this time where these relatively apolitical but deeply French immersed students get to France and start kind of congregating amongst themselves, meeting new figures, hanging out with Vietnamese communists. I think Michael Gable's book, Anti-Imperialist Metropole, is a good example of what the role of Paris, interwar Paris was on what we could call quote unquote global South or third world intellectuals and revolutionaries. I would argue that post-World War II, Paris is the same space. And what you have here is this sense of needing to learn from each other, needing to draw from a broad swath of different ideological wellsprings. And there's also news getting relayed to Paris from various channels and whatnot. So as they're, in Paris, as they're studying, they learn that in 53, oh wait, we're an independent country now, that's great. And then in 54, what happened to democratic elections? I thought Sihanouk was going to lead us on a prodigious democratic path, and now he's interfering in the process and all this sort of thing. So it's during this time that people such as Hu Yun, Salazar and Kusamphan join the French Communist Party. Initially, they are, again, apolitical. They meet and get together in the Groupe des Langues, which are organized by the PCF, the Parti Communiste Français, at the time very much Stalinist under Maurice Thorez, T-H-O-R-E-Z. And it's during this time they also start to realize, okay, well, look, nationalism's great, we have independence, but the problems still remain. Maybe we should look to Marxism, maybe we should look to Leninism. These might be useful tools to obtain true independence. And Hu Nim is the last one on there because he arrives the latest. It is important to note that he's actually, very much, even though people have left by then, by the time of his arrival, like Pol Pot, he's still very much in the orbit of people like Hu Yun and Kusamphan who are still around. Also doctoral students and political economy in Paris. So Hu Nim that's what he'll be pursuing. Initially lives at, he lives in the same places as these guys, the Papillon Industry, which I don't believe is still up, but this is the Cambodia House, or the Maison de Cambodge, that is in Paris right now, near the Jardin Luxembourg. And it's where a lot of them formed and would meet together and discuss. They'd also meet particularly at the house of individuals, more senior members, people who had arrived earlier, to meet and talk and discuss Marxism and things like that, and what anti-imperial ideologies and the like. Here is just an image of Kusamphan that portraying Sita in the Ramayana, or the Ram Khair, the Cambodian version. And I just thought it would be an interesting image to play or to share, because it's Kusamphan and he's not a likable guy. It's also during this time that you have the first foundational national text of democratic Kampuchea. Pol Pot, under the pseudonym Khmer Dayam, or original Khmer, writes handwritten, no Khmer typewriter existed yet, a piece called Monarchy or Democracy, which is released in Khmer Nisut, Khmer Student, in 1952. And in it, he proposes novel solutions to Cambodia's anti-democratic problem, its colonial quagmire, and what he believes is the ultimate example of democracy, Buddha. He proposes that, look at the great revolutions we've ever had in history. The French Revolution comes up. He even writes it in French there. It's not very legible, but you'll see Révolution de 1789. He misspells Danton, one of the French revolutionaries, as Daton, which I thought was pretty funny. But he also mentions the Soviet Union as well, the Bolshevik Revolution in the next line, also prominent, Stalin, Lenin, who he holds quite highly. And in another sense, he talks about the Chinese Republican Revolution with Sun Yat-sen. These are all revolutions that he said fought for a just cause, fought for democracy in their varying ways, and that Cambodia too could be a place where democracy takes root. He uses Buddhist moralism as a way to explain it. Buddha, the great champion of true democracy, and the people standing in the way are like Sihanouk and the French, who only want to disrupt that morality because they're dancing to the tune of French colonial interests. So he will eventually go home without a degree, and in a few years in about 10 years, he will then go to China. And then this is an image from the early 1970s of the Khmer Communist Party, or the Khmer Cambodian, CPK, Communist Party of Kampuchea, one of those days. So Hu Nim himself actually does finish with a degree. He studies in Paris for a bit. He studies initially to enter the civil service, as many of these men were doing. He returns to Cambodia and is immediately enlisted in the National Assembly. He runs for politics. Sihanouk, even though he's a strident critic of him, seems to like, or seems to be keen on having as many intellectuals in his brain trust. Meanwhile, Hu Nim tries to continue his studies at the Université Royale de Phnom Penh, RUPP today, and he's going to finish his doctoral dissertation in 1965. So continuing it, an unfinished one from Paris that he finishes in 65 while he is in politics. In this dissertation, which I read painstakingly over a year, he argues for Cambodia's economy to be oriented, to reorient Cambodian economy outside of this exploitative system where foreign interests had actually created this dependency on the production of consumer goods that 9 out of 10 Khmers couldn't afford anyway. He urges the state, including Sihanouk, I mean, Sihanouk was his benefactor in Paris, so you don't want to be too critical, to seize control of foreign trade and finance. He calls for autonomous development, and specifically in the realms of agricultural production, to replace private sectors in modernizing Cambodia. He uses case studies such as North Korea, China under Mao, specifically the Little Leap or the first 5-year plan, and North Vietnam as his positive case studies for how this can be done. Limited autarky, empowering peasants, creating these mutual aid teams, etc. His peasant analysis in 1962, or his peasant analysis draws from 1962 data. Here he uses Maoist class categories to break down every single socioeconomic class, very similar to Mao's Xinguo and Shunwu investigations. And he diagnoses Cambodia's rural sector as suffering from fragmentation and concentration of lands, specifically that too many lands are concentrated in the hands of too few rich landlords and wealthy peasants. Although this isn't a manual for revolution, we see an effort to try and use Maoist syntax, Maoist vocabulary, and the Maoist lens, the ideological system of Maoism, to interpret Cambodian crises and shape solutions to them. So just kind of going through, because I don't want to get too into all of this right now, because time is not our friend. Just a brief précis of what Hu Nim's career shapes up to be. He works in several newspapers while he works as a politician within Sihanouk's National Assembly. In 65, he joins oppressed Kampuchea Krom, or South Khmer residents, with ties to Pol Pot's party, the Workers' Party of Kampuchea, to form a complaint commission that handled land disputes over claims and confiscations. This wins him a ton of support. They see him as a man of the people and someone who walks the walk. Such progressive activities eventually lead the embassies in Cambodia, in Phnom Penh, notably the PRC embassy, to have close contact with him. And as he recalls in his forced confession in 1977, the Chinese was the closest. The PRC embassy was closest with him. It is through that connection to the PRC embassy that he is one of the founders of the Samāgam Mittphāp Khmer-Chin, or the Association of, or the Khmer-Chinese Friendship Association. It existed from, arguably it existed theoretically from 61 until 67, but in actual praxis, 64 to 67. Its existence, its modus operandi the modus vivendi is to promote PRC Cambodia exchanges, discuss the value of Mao Zedong thought as a global ideology. William Shawcross even described it as an overtly Maoist organization. Strange enough that Sihanouk is actually the official president of it, which is kind of ironic. And because of the ramping up of this rhetoric, right? First and foremost, it was, oh, you'll go to China, we'll have a visit of the delegation here, and we'll send Chinese delegations to Cambodia, we'll tour factories, we'll do, have competing but friendly performances and the like. Eventually, by about 1966-67, they start ramping it up. And because of factors around Phnom Penh, which is again the main site where all this is happening, the radical urban culture that's emerging among overseas Chinese and among radicals who are very critical of Sihanouk, Sihanouk then returns with a heavy-handed response by eliminating all Chinese language newspapers, closing and outlawing this friendship association, and attacking anybody who he suspects as having leftist sympathies, including Hu Nim. And this forces Hu Nim and his contemporaries to flee to the countryside, but I won't go too far ahead. These are, again, apologies for the quality, but photocopies of photocopies from the quarterly review of the Khmer-Chinese Friendship Association of performances. You have the red detachment of women in performance in Phnom Penh, and then a likewise Khmer performance of dance. Can't quite remember which one, but it's written down there below. These issues would also detail all of the meetings that Sihanouk would have while he's in China or while he's hosting representatives in Cambodia. Here you see Zhou Enlai on the right. So another part of this association before it closes is they facilitated these trips to go to China, and Hu Nim is one of these figures who goes. And it is on this trip that he declares that the east wind is going to triumph over the west wind. And this became such an important quote because it found its way back to Sihanouk, who then targets Hu Nim personally. Here I have just the English language translation from Peking Review, just because the Chinese language one wasn't so clear, and I figured I could actually pinpoint exactly the quote that Hu Nim says. So this is the first kind of confirmed visit of a Communist Party of Kampuchea figure, or would-be Communist Party of Kampuchea figure in China. And here he says, the friendship between our two peoples is no ordinary friendship, but one that is steadily developed in the common struggle against US imperialism. So you can already kind of see this real sense of anti-imperialism, but the sense of, again, that China is our fellow traveler, our fellow brother in arms. So Sihanouk claps back. He crushes these Chinese language newspapers. He crushes these Maoist associations. And in response, also, he blames his left-wing ministers, or his ministers who he claims are very left-wing. Hu Nim is avowedly left-wing. There's no disputing that. But he even attacks center-left figures as well. And this forces people like Hu Nim and others to flee to the Maquis, or the liberated zones, quote unquote, where Pol Pot is fighting with his communists. And these intellectuals, Hu Nim included, provide a public face for the Khmer Rouge, which at the time was only going by the name of ANCA, or Angka Podivot, which is revolutionary organization. And because it had no face, there was this kind of sense of, okay, we know who these communists are, we know what they're up to, but we're not entirely sure who our leader is and whether this is even, a true communist revolution yet. This Hu Nim, Khieu Samphan, and Hu Yun provide that public face and are able to charismatically draw many people into the movement. So 1967, it's also an important time when there is a massive civil war that is breaking out in Cambodia. And it begins with the 1967 Samlat Rebellion, where disgruntled peasants in the northwest of Cambodia in Battambang province rise up against Sihanouk's heavy-handed agricultural policies. And this segues in 1970 to a bloodless coup while Sihanouk is in China visiting with Mao. And during this time, the bloodless coup, backed and complicitly backed by the US and the CIA, installs Lon Nol, who at the time is a prime minister, but also a marshal in the army. And Lon Nol will set up the Khmer Republic, which is a US-friendly regime, and he'll rule over it with an iron fist for 5 years until, of course, the Khmer Rouge will take power. So this civil war arguably begins in 67, but the one between the communists and the Khmer Republic is 70 to 75. And it's during this time that Sihanouk gradually is trying to get back into the country. And eventually in 73, he will be able to return to Cambodia, where he meets with the Communist Party of Kampuchea leaders. And you'll notice here in this picture where he's meeting with the Central Committee members, several figures who will become the main brain trust of the Khmer Rouge. Hu Nim is on the right-hand side. It's Khieu Samphan, then Hu Nim. Then the kind of shady figure in the back is Pol Pot. The one on the closest end on the left is Hu Yun, and Young Sari, who's the minister, who will become the Minister of Foreign Affairs. These guys, many of whom are Paris-educated, will eventually fall out of favor once the party takes power. On 17 April 1975, the Khmer Rouge finally capture Phnom Penh, the capital. They claim that Sihanouk they're going to restore him to power, but they do no such thing. And it's just during this time where that collective leadership that had started to grow from 67 to 1975, amid these fleeing, faces, these public faces of the left in Cambodia, with the guys who had been in the Maquis since the 1950s, like Pol Pot, that rift is beginning to widen between them. And Pol Pot starts to consolidate power around those he trusts versus those who are critical of him. And Hu Nim is one of those who is critical. When the Khmer Rouge decide in 1975 to immediately evacuate all cities and force everyone to go work in the countryside, claiming that at once the US was going to bomb them, or that there were enemies that the party needed to identify to root out, is during this time where guys like Hu Nim will stand up and say, why are we doing this? Why are we abolishing currency? This is way too sudden. This is way more intense than anything happened in China. We need to be more gradual. And over time, he'll eventually find himself on the wrong end of Pol Pot's ire. These are just some of the official titles. The party comes out in 1977, announcing internationally that it is a Marxist-Leninist party, in very Maoist language, no less. But from almost the onset and even before, the party has a dark underbelly of ethno-chauvinism and ultranationalism. From as early as 1975, the party is saying we need to eliminate all Vietnamese, period, just over a border dispute, Phu Quoc Island. And those, again, who disagree with this will be particularly in danger, and many of whom die. Hu Yun is dead by 1975 or 76 for criticizing the evacuations of the cities. And Hu Nim will end up in Tuol Sleng prison for criticizing the same. I just have some images of Chinese tech advisors. We're visiting. Andrew Murtha's book, Brothers at Arms, has covered this area extensively. And if anyone's interested in exploring that further on what Chinese tech advisors and experts were doing on the ground, I would highly recommend that one. But in general, most of them, it was very unequal relationship. Most tech advisors from China would actually be confined almost exclusively to Phnom Penh, and they knew even less what was going on than they should have. And in fact, the Khmer Rouge ended up flipping the script on that relationship in many cases. Many tractors that China sent would go unused and fall into disrepair, while the party tried to emphasize that Khmers had built Angkor. They only needed their own hands and the strength of their backs, and that they would rebuild the entire country around rice cultivation in the land that arguably has some of the worst soil for rice cultivation in the world. Just some party newspapers here. This is the Democratic Kampuchea, as they renamed the country in '75, On the Move. Happy times for everyone. Everyone likes working in the countryside. But they're not sharing any information about the mass deaths and the genocide, of course. Now, I mentioned very briefly already, there was the slogan as early as '75 about eliminating all the Vietnamese. I'll just leave it up there for everyone to get a quick sense of it. As Pol Pot is starting to push out his once Paris allies or Paris buddies and start to consolidate it around a very tight-knit core of people who he trusts, he's also starting to let those uglier sides of his education and his influence rise to the forefront, particularly Khmer Dayan, the sense of original Khmer, that we must eliminate all outside influence, we must eliminate all outside people. So targeting the Vietnamese in Cambodia, targeting Buddhist monks, even though Buddhism has been endemic to Cambodia for hundreds and hundreds of years, eliminating Thais, Lao, and Muslim Chams. And they were particularly targeted under the CPK. Buddhist monks, again, were targeted quite frequently in CPK slogans. Here I just have some particularly ugly ones. I hope everyone had dinner before. But describing them again in dehumanizing rhetoric as parasites, tapeworms, essentially vermin that the party needed to cure as the national doctor. And Hu Nim, again, for criticizing the CPK Central Committee's decision to evacuate the cities, particularly Pol Pot's decision to evacuate the cities, he will spend the rest of his life, he's arrested in '77 and dies in the prison upon months of torture, and during which they forced him to write by hand several drafts of his forced confessions, where he writes, this is my biography, this is who I was involved with, I came into the party at this time, these are the people I met, these are the people I frequented with. I am now working for the CIA, I am now working for the Vietnamese to stop Cambodia's perfect and great revolution. That's essentially the précis or gist of what he wrote. And just a figure from the Pol Pot regime by Kiernan of an estimate of the total death tolls. New people were the people who had were now in the work camps, who had previously lived in the cities or had been aligned with the Lon Nol or Sihanouk regimes, whereas the base people were those, as the name implies, who had been in the liberated areas and had worked and fought with the Khmer Rouge for years already. So I know that's a lot to take in, and I look forward to questions about a further explanation about these things, but just in summary of what the book has been trying to do and what this talk has been trying to do is to posit the rise of Maoism in the CPK as a dialectical process with encounters and experiences shaping how this party's intellectual thrust received practice and adapted radical thought. Hu Nim is drawn to Maoism not because he thinks it's especially eloquent, but because he sees it as something, a lens through which he can interpret Cambodian ills and socioeconomic problems and then devise solutions to correct them. And his social experiences inform how that goes. He has a very rural upbringing. He grows up poor. A lot of Mao's emphasis on peasants and workers strikes a sympathetic chord with him initially. But all of these guys were reading Mao in Paris. Why does some of their Maoisms take different shape? Well, it's because Mao Zedong and Maoism have pluralities. They're not one monolithic thing. Pol Pot himself is drawn very much to the Maoism, not that he read in Paris, but what he experiences when he's in China. He's very much fascinated with what Mao is doing in the Cultural Revolution, or when he visited at the tail end of the social education campaign or the socialist education campaign. Whereas Hu Nim is very much drawn to the Mao that he read. His investigations, rural investigations, the political economy of Mao, the rational bureaucratic Mao is what draws him to looking at Maoism and taking it seriously. And just as the CCP broke into kind of conflictual camps ideologically, where the rational bureaucratic managerial Maoist like Liu Shaoqi falls out of favor by the time we get to Lushan, and Peng Dehuai is another example with Lushan, and then the faith Maoists like Lin Biao kind of take over in China. You have the same thing happening in the CPK as well. Those more managerial, more kind of political economy Maoists are on the outside looking in and are dead by the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, whereas those who were more drawn to the Maoism on faith impulses are the ones staying around, and many of whom would end up alive for another few decades, sadly. So that is my talk today. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with me with lots of names and moving parts. And I look forward to your questions and comments.